What's the strangest thing you've ever eaten? A dare at a party? A delicacy on vacation? For most of us, it's a fun story to tell. But what if a single, innocuous dish held a secret so bizarre, so unsettling, it could unravel a family's entire history? Today, we're diving into a story about a seemingly simple bowl of duck blood soup and the truly strange secret ingredient that lay hidden within it for generations. This is a tale of mystery, tradition, and a truth that was never meant to be uncovered. Before we journey into the heart of this culinary mystery, if you enjoy stories that blend the mysterious with the mundane, that find horror in the familiar, do me a solid and hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. You won't want to miss what we're cooking up next. Now, settle in, and let's talk about the Tran family's famous soup. The Tran family legacy wasn't built on gold or land, but on the rich, dark broth of their duck blood soup, known throughout the old quarter of Hanoi as Bun Mang Vit. For 3 generations, their small, unassuming restaurant, Pho Gia Trien Tran, had a line snaking down the narrow street from dawn until they sold their last bowl. The secret, everyone whispered, was in the soup. It had a depth, an umami that no other vendor could replicate. It was earthy, yet ethereal, savory, yet with a whisper of something almost sweet, a flavor that lingered on the palate and in the memory. Lin, at 26, was the sole heir to this legacy. Her grandmother, Ba Tran, was the matriarch of the family and the keeper of the recipe. A woman whose back was now bent like a drawn bow from decades stooped over a simmering pot. Ba Tran's eyes were still as sharp and clear as the broth she served. She ruled her kitchen with an iron ladle, and the recipe was her most guarded possession. It was not written down. It was a living thing, passed from mother to daughter through touch, taste, and whispered instructions over the steam of the great stockpot. Lin had grown up in the kitchen's embrace. The scent of star anise, cinnamon, and grilled ginger was the perfume of her childhood. She had learned to deboine a duck with surgical precision by the age of 10 and could distinguish between 6 different kinds of fermented shrimp paste by smell alone. Yet, the final, crucial step of the soup-making process remained a mystery to her. It was a ritual performed by her grandmother alone, in the pre-dawn hours in the locked kitchen. Ba Tran would emerge, face slick with sweat and steam, and only then would she allow Lin back inside to help with the day's service. "Patience, little bird," Ba Tran would say, her voice raspy like dried leaves. "The soup decides when you are ready. Not me." But Lin's patience was wearing thin. Her grandmother was now 84. Her hands, once so steady, had begun to tremble. Sometimes she would forget a supplier's name or misplace her keys. The fear of the secret recipe dying with her was a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety in Lin's chest. More than that, Lin's ambition burned brighter than the flames under the stockpot. She dreamed of expanding, of a second location, perhaps even a cookbook. But without the complete recipe, she was merely her grandmother's assistant, a custodian of a legacy she didn't fully own. The turning point came during the annual Mid-Autumn Festival. The restaurant was busier than ever. The steam from the kitchen fogged the windows, and the clatter of bowls and chopsticks was a deafening symphony. Ba Tran, looking more frail than Lin had ever seen her, stumbled while carrying a heavy tray of duck innards. She didn't fall, but she swayed, her face paling to a ghostly white. Lin rushed to her side, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Ba," Lin pleaded that night, after they had cleaned the last bowl and locked the doors. "You must teach me. All of it. What if something happens to you? The soup, the family, it all ends." Ba Tran sat on a low wooden stool, her small frame seeming to shrink into the shadows of the quiet kitchen. She looked at the giant, blackened stockpot, which sat cooling in the center of the room like an ancient idol. Her gaze was distant, lost in a memory Lin couldn't access. "It is not so simple, Lin," she finally whispered. "The secret carries a weight, a burden. I have carried it my whole life. My mother carried it before me. I wanted to spare you that." "I am stronger than you think," Lin insisted, her voice firm. "I am not a child anymore. It's my birthright." Her grandmother studied her for a long moment, her dark eyes searching Lin's. Lin saw a flicker of something she had never seen before in their depths, not just pride, but a profound, heart-wrenching sadness. Finally, with a sigh that seemed to carry the dust of ages, Batran nodded. "Tomorrow," she said, "before the sun rises, be here, and bring a strong heart, little bird. You will need it." Lin barely slept that night, her mind racing with possibilities. What could the secret be? A rare, undocumented herb from the mountains? A complex fermentation process? A specific breed of duck that was a family secret? Every scenario she concocted seemed plausible yet inadequate to explain the lifetime of secrecy and the sorrow in her grandmother's eyes. She arrived at the restaurant when the moon was still high in the ink-black sky. The air was cool and smelled of damp pavement and the faint aroma of yesterday's spices. The kitchen was dark, save for a single, bare bulb hanging over the central workstation. Batran was already there, standing before the cold stockpot. She was dressed not in her usual kitchen clothes, but in a traditional black ao dye, the kind reserved for funerals and ancestral worship. An unnerving chill crept up Lin's spine. "Lock the door," Batran commanded, her voice devoid of its usual warmth. Lin obeyed, the click of the heavy bolt echoing in the silence. When she turned back, her grandmother had placed a small, lacquered box on the steel table. It was old, the black lacquer worn at the edges to reveal the dark wood beneath. Lin had never seen it before. "My mother gave this to me when it was my time," Batran said, her fingers tracing the intricate mother-of-pearl inlay, a scene of a crane flying over a marsh. "And her mother gave it to her. It contains the soul of our soup." With trembling hands, she opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded red velvet, was not a spice, not a dried root, not a recipe scroll. It was a small, crudely made knife with a handle of yellowed bone and a short, curved blade of dark, pitted metal. Next to it lay a small, earthenware pot, sealed with wax. "What is this?" Lin asked, her voice a whisper. Batran did not answer immediately. She picked up the bone-handled knife, her knuckles white. She looked at Lin, her eyes filled with a terrible, ancient pain. "Every family has a ghost, Lin," she said, her voice trembling. "A story they tell themselves to forget the truth. Our family has a soup. The secret ingredient isn't something you add to the pot. It is something you give to it." She took a deep, shuddering breath, her composure finally cracking. "The flavor, the richness that no one can replicate, comes from us, from the blood of the women who make it." Lin stared, her mind refusing to process the words. It had to be a metaphor, a strange, symbolic lesson. "Bah, I don't understand." "You will," Batran said softly. She held out the knife. "Before every new batch, a small sacrifice is made. A few drops, a token of our life force, given to the ancestors who first created this recipe. It is a blood pact, a promise to continue the legacy, and in return, the soup provides for us." She took the knife and, before Lin could react, made a swift, shallow cut on the palm of her own hand. A thin line of dark red blood welled up. She unsealed the small earthenware pot. Inside was a dark, almost black, viscous paste. Her blood dripped into it, and she stirred it once with the tip of the knife before resealing it. "This paste," she explained, her voice regaining some of its familiar, instructional tone, "is the starter. It has been kept alive for almost 100 years. It contains the blood of my mother, and her mother before her. A tiny amount is mixed into a fresh batch of duck blood before it is congealed. It imparts the connection, the history, the essence." Lin felt the world tilt on its axis. The blood, her grandmother's blood, her great-grandmother's blood. This wasn't a recipe. It was a ritual of self-mutilation, a dark and secret tradition masquerading as culinary art. Every bowl of soup she had ever served, ever eaten, was tainted with this impossible truth. The earthy, unique flavor she had cherished her whole life was the taste of her own ancestry. Nausea rose in her throat, hot and acidic. "Why?" she choked out, stumbling back a step. How could this even start? Ba Tran's face was a mask of weary resignation. It began with my grandmother, your great-grandmother, and it was a time of great famine. Her husband was gone, her children were starving. She had nothing but a single, scrawny duck and a few vegetables. In her desperation, she prayed to the ancestors for a miracle. She believed that to receive a gift, one must first give one. The only thing she had left to give was a piece of herself. So she added her own blood to the ducks, cooked it, and fed it to her children. And they survived. She looked at Lin, her eyes pleading for understanding. It became a story of sacrifice, of a mother's love. A symbol. But the story became a ritual, and the ritual became a requirement. The soup she made that day was so nourishing, so deeply flavorful, that the legend grew. People said it had a magical quality. And my mother and then we felt we had to honor that sacrifice. We believed that if we stopped, the legacy would crumble, the family would fail. The magic would be gone. Lin stared at the lacquered box, at the bone-handled knife, at the line of blood welling on her grandmother's wrinkled palm. The sounds of the waking city, the distant rumble of motorbikes, the first calls of the street vendors began to filter into the silent kitchen. The world outside was normal, oblivious to the grotesque secret contained within these four walls. Her grandmother now held the small earthenware pot out to her. Her gaze was steady, an unspoken question in her eyes. The tradition had been revealed. The knife lay on the table. The legacy, in all its dark and twisted glory, was now hers to accept or refuse. Lin looked from the pot to her own hands, smooth and unscarred. The inheritance she had so desperately craved was finally being offered, but it was a poisoned chalice. Her choice was simple and stark: to continue the bloody ritual that had defined her family for generations, or to be the one who finally broke the chain, risking the end of everything she had ever known and loved. The week following the revelation was a silent, waking nightmare for Lin. Every morning, she would enter the kitchen and see the great stockpot not as a source of pride, but as a sacrificial altar. The rich, steaming aroma of the broth, a scent she had once loved more than any other, now seemed to carry the metallic tang of blood. She would watch customers slurp their noodles, their faces alight with pleasure, and feel a profound sense of revulsion and guilt. They were savoring her family's pain, consuming a secret she was now complicit in keeping. She couldn't bring herself to perform the ritual. The first day after the confession, Ba Tran had looked at her expectantly, the lacquered box open on the steel table. Lin had simply shaken her head, unable to form words, and walked away. To her surprise, her grandmother didn't press her. She had simply sighed, made the small cut on her own worn palm as she had always done, and begun the day's work. Continued this way for days. A silent, tense dance around a truth that lay between them, as thick and suffocating as the kitchen steam. Lin began to feel like a ghost in her own life. She was disconnected from her work, her family, her own history. The soup was no longer just food. It was a liquid manifestation of a lie. She started experimenting. Late at night, after her grandmother was asleep, she would stay behind in the kitchen. She tried to replicate the soup's unique flavor without the secret ingredient. She added a rare mushroom powder known for its earthy, blood-like taste. She tried a special blend of fermented black beans and a hint of molasses. She microdosed with different types of soy sauce and fish sauce, seeking that elusive, lingering finish. Some of her attempts were close, deceptively close. One batch, using a shiitake mushroom and red fermented tofu reduction, was so similar that for a fleeting moment, she felt a surge of triumph. But when she tasted it side by side with her grandmother's original broth, the difference was undeniable. Her version was excellent, a high-quality, delicious soup. But it lacked the soul, the strange, almost primal resonance that made their family's soup legendary. It was like a perfect replica of a masterpiece. Technically flawless, but missing the artist's spirit. Her secret experiments did not go unnoticed. One night, Ba Tran found her hunched over a small pot, a dozen little bowls with different concoctions arranged before her. The old woman didn't scold her. She simply picked up a spoon, tasted Lin's best attempt, and then tasted the broth from the main pot. "It is a good soup, little bird," she said, her voice gentle. "But it is not our soup. It could be—" Lin shot back, her frustration boiling over. "It could be a new soup. An honest soup. Bah, we can't continue this. It's insane. It's self-harm, passed down as tradition." "It is our story," Ba Tran replied, her voice unwavering. "It is the story of Anne's sacrifice. To change the soup is to say her sacrifice was meaningless. Her sacrifice was to save her children from starving." Lin argued, her voice rising. "We are not starving. We own a successful restaurant. We can afford the best ingredients. We don't need to bleed into our food anymore. The blood is not for flavor, Lin." "Not really," Ba Tran said, her eyes pleading. "It is for memory. It is a reminder of where we came from, of the price of survival. I look at my scar, and I remember my mother. I remember her stories of An. It keeps them alive. It keeps us chained to the past," Lin whispered, defeated. Their stalemate continued. A cold war fought over a simmering pot. Lin's relationship with her grandmother, once the bedrock of her life, became strained and brittle. The easy affection and shared laughter that had once filled the kitchen were replaced by a heavy silence, punctuated only by the necessary communications of their work. Lin felt increasingly isolated. Who could she talk to about this? The secret was so bizarre, so taboo, that speaking it aloud felt like a transgression of the highest order. But the burden of it was crushing her. She found a strange sort of solace in research. She began spending her afternoons at the National Library, poring over old books on Vietnamese history, folklore, and regional culinary traditions. She was looking for a loophole, a historical precedent, anything that could help her understand or even justify her family's ritual. She found stories of blood oaths and ancient animist rituals, but nothing that directly connected to food preparation in this way. Her family's secret seemed to be uniquely their own, a twisted branch on the vast tree of tradition. During her research, she stumbled upon articles about the Great Famine of 1945, the period when her great-grandmother and had made her desperate sacrifice. Reading the harrowing accounts of starvation, of people forced to eat roots and grass, of bodies lying in the streets of Hanoi, she began to understand the depth of Anne's desperation in a way she never had before, and hadn't been creating a recipe. She had been trying to will her children to live. Lin felt a pang of empathy, a flicker of understanding for the generations of women who had honored that moment of fierce, maternal love. But understanding was not acceptance. One day, Lin came across a collection of local merchant records from the French colonial period. On a whim, she looked up the original address of her family's first food stall. She found it, and next to it, a name she didn't recognize, co-owned by Tran Tien and a Mr. Koji Sato. Koji Sato, a Japanese name. Lin's blood ran cold. The Japanese occupation of Vietnam was the direct cause of the 1945 famine. Their policies of forcing farmers to grow jute instead of rice had led to mass starvation. What was a Japanese man doing in business with her great-grandmother, a victim of that very famine? The discovery gnawed at her. It didn't fit the family narrative of An, the desperate widow, saving her family alone. Who was Koji Sato? There were no stories about him, no mention in any of her grandmother's tales. He was a ghost in their history. Driven by a new, urgent need for truth, Lin approached her grandmother that evening. She didn't mention her research. Instead, she asked about her great-grandfather. "Bah," she began gently. "Tell me about great-grandfather. What was he like?" Ba Tran, who was mending an apron, paused, her needle hovering in midair. "He died in the war against the French," she said, her voice flat, reciting the official family story. "He was a hero. But before that, when he was with great-grandmother An." A shuddered look came over Ba Tran's face. "Your great-grandmother did not speak of him much. His memory brought her pain." Lin knew she was treading on dangerous ground, but she had to push. "I was at the library. I saw some old city records. It listed the first stall. It said An had a business partner. A Japanese man named Koji Sato. The apron slipped from Ba-Tran's lap. The color drained from her face. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the ticking of an old clock on the wall. For a moment, Lin thought her grandmother might faint. "You should not have seen that," Ba-Tran whispered, her voice barely audible. "Who was he?" Lin pressed, her heart pounding. Ba-Tran closed her eyes, and when she opened them, they were filled with a profound and ancient sorrow, a sorrow that seemed to dwarf the secret of the blood. "He was not her business partner," she said slowly, each word a heavy stone. "He was a Japanese officer, and he was my father." The confession hung in the air, shattering the very foundation of Lin's world. Her heroic great-grandfather, the one who died fighting for Vietnam, was a lie. Her real great-grandfather was one of the oppressors, an agent of the very regime that had caused the famine her family's entire identity was built upon. "Great-grandmother and she was never married to the man you call your grandfather," Ba-Tran continued, her voice a monotone of long-rehearsed pain. "During the occupation, Mr. Sato took a liking to her. He forced himself upon her. My mother was the result of that violence. He set her up with the food stall as a way to provide for them, to ease his conscience perhaps. It was his money that bought the first pot, the first ducks." Lin could barely breathe. The story of sacrifice, of a desperate mother's love, was a carefully constructed facade, built to hide a history of shame and violence. "And the blood ritual?" Lin asked, dreading the answer. Ba-Tran flinched. "When the war ended and the Japanese were driven out, and was terrified. She was the woman who had survived because of a Japanese officer's patronage. She had his child. Her neighbors were starving while she had a business. People would have called her a collaborator, a traitor. They might have killed her or my mother." She picked up the fallen apron, her hands trembling violently now. "So she created a new story, a story of terrible sacrifice. She told everyone she had made a pact with the spirits, that she fed the soup with her own life force. She made a great show of her piety and her suffering. The cut on her hand was not a secret. It was proof of her sacrifice for her children, a way to transform her shame into a badge of honor. No one would question the patriotism of a woman who literally bled for her family. The story became her shield. The truth was so much darker, so much more complex than Lin could ever have imagined. The secret ingredient was not just blood. It was a lie born of trauma, shame, and a desperate will to survive. The ritual wasn't to honor a sacrifice. It was to perpetuate the cover story that had protected her family from a violent and unforgiving history. Lin looked at her grandmother, this small, stooped woman who had carried the weight of this lie her entire life. She understood now the sadness in her eyes, the burden she had spoken of. It was the burden of upholding a painful deception, of cutting her own flesh to maintain a story that was never true. Her personal quest to change the recipe suddenly felt naive, even selfish. This was about so much more than a flavor profile. This was about unearthing a buried history, about confronting a generational trauma that had been simmering just beneath the surface of their lives, hidden in plain sight in every bowl of soup they ever served. The question was no longer just about the future of the soup, but about the future of their family's truth. Could they, after nearly a century of hiding, finally afford to be honest? The kitchen, once a place of simmering tension, was now a tomb of shared, unspoken grief. The revelation of Koji Sato had fractured the very bedrock of Lin's identity, and she could see its echoes in the hollowed-out look in her grandmother's eyes. The lie wasn't just a story. It had been a cage, and for the first time, Lin realized Ba-Tran had been its prisoner her entire life. The daily ritual of the knife was not an act of reverence but a constant, physical reminder of the violent, shameful secret of her own parentage. For 2 days, they worked in near-total silence, the rhythm of their chopping and stirring a hollow echo of what it once was. Lin felt a strange, new emotion blossoming in her chest alongside her shock and anger. A deep, aching compassion for her grandmother. She saw not a stubborn traditionalist, but a woman who had performed an act of painful penance every single day, punishing herself for a history she had no part in creating. The turning point came not from a confrontation, but from a quiet observation. It was a sweltering afternoon, and Batran, exhausted, had fallen asleep on a small stool in the corner of the kitchen. Her worn, wrinkled hand lay limp in her lap, palm up. Lin could see the crisscrossing of faint, silvery scars that mapped a lifetime of lies. It was a geography of pain. In that moment, Lin's resolve hardened into something unbreakable. The legacy she needed to inherit wasn't a recipe. It was a liberation. That night, after the last customer had gone, Lin didn't go to her experimental pots. Instead, she sat down at the small kitchen table across from her grandmother. She reached into her bag and placed the old merchant records she had photocopied from the library on the table. Koji Sato's name was stark against the yellowed paper. Batran flinched, but didn't look away. "This is our history, Ba," Lin said, her voice soft but firm. "Not the story we tell, but the truth. And we don't have to be ashamed of it." "You don't understand, Lin," her grandmother whispered. "The world was different then. To be a Linlak, a collaborator, it was a death sentence. And did what she had to do to protect my mother. To protect me." "I know," Lin said. "And I am grateful. Her story didn't just protect you. It built this entire life for us. But the danger is gone, Ba. The war is long over. The only person this secret is hurting now is you." Lin reached across the table and gently took her grandmother's scarred hand. "Every time you do this," she said, her thumb tracing the faint lines, "you are punishing yourself for the crimes of a man you never even knew. You are living in fear. But we don't have to be afraid anymore." Tears, thick and slow, began to roll down Batran's cheeks, dripping onto their joined hands. It was the first time Lin had ever seen her grandmother cry. "What do we do?" Batran asked, her voice cracking, frail. "The soup. It is all we have. If the story is a lie, what is the soup?" "The soup is not a lie," Lin said with a certainty that surprised even herself. "The soup is the truth. It's the story of Anne's survival. It's the story of her fierce will to protect her child. It's the story of you, continuing that legacy of protection. The blood was just the ink she used to write the story. We can choose to write the next chapter in a different way." For the first time, a flicker of something other than sorrow appeared in Batran's eyes. It was a fragile, tentative spark of hope. The next morning, Lin woke before dawn. When she entered the kitchen, she found her grandmother standing by the workstation. The lacquered box was on the table, but it was closed. Batran looked at Lin, a silent question in her eyes. Lin walked over to her experimental corner and retrieved a small jar. It contained the dark, umami-rich paste she had perfected over the last few weeks, the reduction of shiitake, fermented tofu, and black beans. It was her best attempt, the one that tasted so deceptively close to the original. She placed it on the table beside the lacquered box. "A new story," Lin said softly. Batran looked at the jar, then at the box. She hesitated for a long moment, her hand hovering over the familiar lacquered surface. Then, with a deep, shuddering breath that seemed to release the tension of a lifetime, she slid the box to the far side of the table. She picked up Lin's jar, uncapped it, and inhaled the aroma. She dipped a clean spoon in, tasted a tiny amount, and closed her eyes. She didn't speak. She simply nodded. It was a small gesture, but it felt as momentous as the shifting of continents. Together, side by side, they prepared the soup. They worked in their old, familiar rhythm, but the energy between them was different. It was lighter. When it came time to prepare the duck blood, Batran wordlessly handed the bowl to Lin. Lin took a spoonful of her new paste and stirred it in. The dark red liquid swirled, accepting the new ingredient without protest. They opened the restaurant that morning with a shared, unspoken anxiety. Would anyone notice? Would the magic be gone? The first customers filed in, the regulars who could detect the slightest deviation in flavor. Lin held her breath as the first man, a grizzled cyclo driver who had been eating their soup for 40 years, took his first sip. He slurped loudly, his brow furrowed in concentration. Then his face relaxed into a smile. "Delicious as always, Ba Tran," he called out. "You've outdone yourself today." One by one, customers ate, paid, and left satisfied and oblivious. No one noticed a difference. The soul of the soup, Lin realized, had never been in the blood. It was in the care, the history, the love that went into it. It was in the hands that made it. The unique flavor they had attributed to the blood ritual was perhaps nothing more than a powerful placebo, a story they had told themselves for so long that they had willed it to be true. The power had never been in the ingredient, but in the belief behind it. At the end of the day, as they cleaned the now empty stockpot, Ba Tran turned to Lin. "What will we do with this?" she asked, gesturing to the lacquered box. Lin thought for a moment. They could throw it away, bury it, destroy it. But that felt wrong. It was still a part of their history, a symbol of the fear and strength that had brought them here. "Let's keep it," Lin said. "Not as a tool, but as a reminder of the story that kept us safe, and the truth that set us free." The next week, a small change appeared on the restaurant sign. Below the classic name, Foggia Trian Tran, a new line was added in neat, modern script, a story of mothers and daughters since 1945. Lin finally began working on her cookbook. The first chapter was not about ingredients or techniques. It was titled The Story of an, and it told the true, unvarnished history of her great-grandmother. It spoke of the horrors of the famine, of the violence of the occupation, and of a young woman's impossible choice. It reframed her not as a mystical figure who bled for her art, but as a survivor of immense strength and cunning who built a shield of legend to protect her daughter. The duck blood soup recipe in the book did not call for a blood sacrifice. It called for shiitake mushrooms and fermented tofu. But in the notes below, Lin wrote, "The most important ingredient is memory. Remember the stories of the women who came before you. Understand their sacrifices, both real and imagined. And then, with every stir of the spoon, choose to create a future that is nourishing, honest, and free." The restaurant continued to thrive, its legacy secured not by a dark secret, but by a liberated truth. And the soup had never tasted better.